name is F.A.Kavanaugh. In May 13th, 1967, I was a member of the coordinating board of the Haight-Ashbury Neighborhood Council, and I delivered a position paper on the future of the Haight-Ashbury at the University of California Health Center in San Francisco. I have been a resident of the Haight-Ashbury for 14 years. I spent my boyhood here from 1938 to 1945, moved away with my family, and then returned to the neighborhood in 1960 when I married. My boyhood here was a happy one, as I recall it. This was partly due, I think, to the fortunate proximity of the many parks, the hills, the forests, the streets themselves, which afforded us generous playing areas where young children could shape themselves through adventure and play in a happily unregimented and loosely structured experiential environment. Most of us didn't have much money, and it was of no great concern. There were too many things to do, and if we momentarily tired of some, we invented others. We owned the backyards, the streets as well as the sidewalks, the schoolyards, the vacant lots, the cliffs on the heights, the deep woods and the forest, the trees and the meadows and the hills of the park. We built our coasters, flew our kites, picked blackberries, spun our tops, kicked the can, used every hiding place for a mile around, and wore a pair of kids out every 6 months playing 10 varieties of ball. We feasted on giant dills and day-old donuts, on RC colas and creamsicles. On Saturday afternoon, the Haight Theater was ours. We exulted to the thunder of hooves, the clash of swords, Laurel's giggle, and Shirley's dimple. The memories are still clear and sharp. I could go on, but there is no need. My point is that life was not dull in this neighborhood then. It was an exciting, joyful place.
I hardly need mention that it is still an exciting place, but for some, joy seems to have fled the streets to be replaced by anxiety and even fear.
This is pitiable, for this neighborhood has the potential for becoming a great experiment in revolutionary modern living based on people instead of things.
2 years ago, the neighborhood was much quieter. It had been integrated for several years. That is, black and white were living side by side with no violent incident. There wasn't much communication between the races, but at least there was peaceful coexistence. Quite a few people were working for real integration. They thought that if it could work at all, it should work in a place such as the Haight-Ashbury, where there was some community pride based on common efforts against outside freeway, housing, and educational policies. The democratic processes were fermenting. The neighborhood council was small but active, its membership acquiring considerable knowledge in the methods of City Hall and skill in political infighting. Some of the churches were active in supporting the fight of minority groups for welfare, housing, and educational rights.
Many, under the pressures of these same fights, were beginning to appreciate the unique quality of the neighborhood, its welcome variety of geographical features, people, structures. They felt more vital in living here because it presented certain problems which they themselves had to work out.
I think, in the minds of most, the problem of genuine integration, the need to have the races living together in peace and harmony, was uppermost. That was where they were starting to direct their energies. Some moved out as their answer to the problem, but many stayed.
My wife and I were probably pretty typical. We decided to buy a home in the summer of '65. And we decided to buy and stay in this neighborhood because, simply enough, we thought the problem of integration was everybody's problem, and we couldn't run away from it. I teach high school boys, and I wouldn't feel right teaching one set of principles and living another. And we thought that living in an integrated neighborhood actively would eliminate the problem of prejudice in the lives of our children later.
Some say that the civil rights movement has died. I think rather than one phase of a public demonstration of protest to affect legislation ran its course and died a natural death. Now the responsibility is largely in the hands of the white middle class, where it has always belonged.
This is the class which has evidenced the most prejudice and has controlled the most votes. It is the class to which minority groups aspire and holds the key, and it has kept the doors locked.
I really think many of the white middle class were acknowledging their guilt to themselves and started to turn their keys.
Then, suddenly, we were faced with a new kind of integration. Beards, sandals, off-mode clothing suddenly appeared amongst us. The new community had arrived, attracted by low rents and many vacancies, many caused by people fleeing the black wave, by mild weather and pleasant proximity to parks, by perhaps a vague notion that this was a relatively tolerant neighborhood. And for many reasons, known only to themselves, they became a part of our lives. And life will never be the same again. Thank God for that.
Thank God for that.
Thank God for that.
After the shock of initial alarm died, then the shock of recognition set in. The freaks slowly emerged as people. And members of the older community were forced into a painful kind of self-examination. If anything, these new neighbors, by their very disavowal of many things we hold to be essential, caused us to pause and consider our own value systems. If some called them phony, then we had to admit to just as great a degree of phoniness in our lives. They forced us to look into mirrors in unflattering light.
And a continuing dialogue was started in several places at the same time. The town hall, which has become an old and new community monthly confrontation, was diverted from its original track. The neighborhood council chose a tolerant stance and welcomed the new people as new members of the one community. The churches attempted to direct their congregation toward tolerant attitudes.
We all know the history of the last few months, at least of the obvious manifestations of change. I would estimate that even though there have been many unwelcome incidents occasioned by both the old and new community, there has still arisen an area of understanding and mutual appreciation. I would describe it in this fashion. The new community, by its rejection of certain middle-class attitudes of comfort, security, position, and property, has pointed out to us our exaggerated concern for these material distractions. In their effort to create new lifestyles based on personalism and simple awareness of the basic love of sensible creation, they make us more aware
Of the overall pleasures of colors, sound, trees, children, smiles.
Yet I think that they have learned much from us too. They have learned that the neighborhood in which they have chosen to demonstrate their rejection of middle-class conformity is not such a bad neighborhood after all. If they have been the victims of generalized attitudes by authority, they have also been the perpetrators of generalized attitudes themselves. Not all middle-class people are squares. Generally speaking, upon the close personal particular examination of any square by any hippie, the sharp corners soften considerably, and the image of a human being appears. They have to acknowledge that they have received considerable toleration, freedom, kindness, and recognition as persons in this neighborhood. And they have to admit that much of their bitter protest is misdirected in this particular neighborhood.
I think that the confrontation has been very healthy. Given more time and the absence of undue friction, the dialogue could bear rich fruit. The old and new could form one community, unique and rich in human resources, a community that could demonstrate that such a neighborhood could flourish despite the system. Indeed, one that could bear the seed for a joyous revolution of attitudes in the entire city and produce a large urban community based on the real needs of its inhabitants.
This dialogue would teach many important things. Members of the old community would learn that beards are not evil, that a job is not the only means to productive work, that a simple request, "Please let me by," will be answered with a smile and making of a passageway. At any rate, this works for me when I encounter those ever-present groups of people who block the entrances to churches, meeting halls, school corridors, any place where people congregate. That the young are noisier, that some of the inhabitants of pads merely utilize space better than we do, that granted the clothing of the young ladies might seem a bit bizarre, it is still far more practical and modest than that decreed by society's fashion setters. That these young people behave, by and large, just as well, if not better, than do ours when they are away from our parental gaze.
And the new community might learn that a motorcycle, although an economical and exciting vehicle, is yet very noisy. That new forms of music which bend willing minds also blast unwilling eardrums. That joyful sidewalk chatter late at night disturbs the peace of others. That many people, through no fault of their own, have to work at night and rest during the day. That many old people are frightened by what they consider strange behavior. And although this fear is largely unwarranted, it is real, and that it is hellish to exploit this fear for the sake of a few sophomoric laughs. Rather, it is better to overcome this fear by unstinting overt acts of kindness. That it is one thing to drop out of society, it is another to sneer arrogantly at any human being. The streets belong to all people for a variety of reasons.
We can learn many things from each other.
Yep.
We can learn many things from each other.
We can learn many things from each other.
We can learn many things from each other.
But the whole process may come to naught this summer. The prospect of a mass influx by young people poses a real threat. We might agree that tourism is a good thing when people visit a different place to learn about the people, customs, and values of that place. In that sense, travel broadens a person's humanity. But when the tourists have such great numbers that they noticeably alter the essential nature of that place, then effectively they have destroyed that which they sought. That is one of the dangers of the summer. One of the reasons that the Haight-Ashbury has been such a good neighborhood in the past is that it was not a tourist showcase. Much of the trouble the past few months has been due to the influx of curious tourists and feverish excitement seekers.
And for the life of me, I cannot conceive of any humane way of stemming the tide at this late date. I am against the barricades on freeways and bridges. I am against the undue prosecution of laws on young people who have been seduced by the mass media to a scene. If the city that knows how can entertain 100,000 for a political convention or accommodate 250,000 for a rosary crusade, then perhaps it can display kindness and tolerance to these young people. It would be a rather delightful twist of circumstance if the young rebels who come to drop out for the summer were met with the unexpected embrace of an enlightened middle class. The problem belongs to the city and not just the Haight-Ashbury.
And here in our neighborhood, if we work together to make life bearable this summer, we can form a solid basis of community which may last over the remainder of the year.
If the straight community does not turn off its fear and respond to the many needs which will become apparent this summer, then it will only affirm the ugly image of narrow self-concern which had originally been attributed to it by the new community.
If the new community, in turn, does not turn off the hallucinogenic trip and turn on to all the people, then it will assume a hypocritical posture of narcissism.
particulars can be worked out.
What is important is that
We work together. If the straight community loses this summer, then we both lose. For the new community will have proved to be nothing but a disruptive influence which has loved a neighborhood to death.
If the new community loses this summer,
Then we both lose.
For the old community will have to admit to a tolerance which couldn't tolerate all people.
And then, perhaps in the fall after the circus, we can get down to the serious problems of human need.
Adequate schools for all our people, dignified housing conditions for all our people,
a solid front against exploitation of any form,
common culture based on positive communication, physical enhancement of the neighborhood, personal growth and human dignity through mutual concern, conversation, and endeavor.
The solution to the summer problem cannot be left in the hands of the institutions and bureaucracy. They are not equipped for it. Rather, they can only help those who should be able to respond, the people of San Francisco.
If every Catholic in the city of San Francisco were to familiarize himself with the contents of the documents of Vatican II, he would feel himself responsible to the needs of the young people with no other qualifications. No Christian can ask for the credentials of the needy.
For no Christian can ask credentials of the needy.
No Christian can ask for the credentials of the needy.
No Christian can ask for the credential of the needy.
Rolling tape and
Happy birthday, Papa Frank! Happy birthday, Grandpa Frank! Bon anniversaire! You're making you my king!
amazing.
I brought up that.